Revolutions Per Minute is a weekly radio show from the New York City chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America. Recorded live at WBAI 99.5 in Brooklyn every Wednesday at 9 p.m. RPM's about doing the work to build a democratic socialist future. Each week, hear the latest news, analysis, and organizing experience from the minds and hearts of activists fighting every day in New York City. Join the movement at Socialists.NYC.
Hey, what's up, New York City? It's Amy Wilson. You are listening to Revolutions Per Minute live on WBAI. We are a socialist radio show and podcast from members of the New York City Democratic Socialists of America. The Democratic Socialists of America is the largest socialist organization in the United States with 90,000 members nationwide. NYC-DSA is its biggest chapter. We are run by our 7,000 plus members and organizers who are working together to build democratic socialism in all 5 boroughs. Once again, my name is Amy Wilson. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a member of North Brooklyn DSA. Last night, I was out with a friend for a lovely walk in Brooklyn when we came across a protest and vigil for the first anniversary of the murder of George Floyd. As hundreds of people occupied the amphitheater area in front of the Brooklyn Museum to share stories and collectively mourn, at least 15 NYPD vehicles lurked on Eastern Parkway 100 yards away. The police presence included the large vans used to transport people who have been arrested and 2 vans for NYPD's notorious Strategic Response Group, or SRG, a riot control division which has violently arrested, pepper sprayed, and intimidated anti-racist and anti-fascist protesters consistently over the last year, including my friends, my comrades, and myself. SRG was established in 2015 and has a yearly budget of an estimated $68 million. I know it doesn't have to be this way. We can change our city for the better by redistributing the massive amount of resources NYPD uses to harass and intimidate New Yorkers and investing that money in healthcare, education, housing, parks, art, and other things that will actually improve our quality of life and keep our communities safe. Tonight on Revolutions Per Minute, we'll hear from DSA-endorsed candidate for City Council District 22, Tiffany Cabán, a longtime de-carceral activist, on why she was proud to sign on to DSA's vision for real public safety and budget justice. We'll also be taking your calls live with Kay Gabriel, an NYC-DSA member and Defund NYPD organizer. But first, the headlines with Jack Devine.
Yo, what's good, New York? This is Jack Devine with the headlines brought to you by thethorn.nyc. Centrist Democrats, labor unions, and gig economy companies are working out a compromise bill that would allow gig workers to, quote, unionize, but still not be able to strike or be considered employees. State Senate Labor Committee Chair Jessica Ramos, District 13 Queens, made a statement that appeared to challenge the current plan. New York State Attorney General Letitia James proposed new legislation that would impose stricter use of force guidelines on police throughout the state. The AG's office has had jurisdiction over police killings since Governor Cuomo issued an executive order in 2015, but has secured no convictions in that time. The Department of Homeless Services will hire 112 new temporary workers to track homelessness on the subways as the MTA resumes 24-hour service, alarming some advocates who worry that the move pretends homeless sweeps. 5 of the top 8 leading mayoral candidates have pledged to veto any legislation that will repeal the city's term limits for local elected officials. Subway ridership continues to rise as 24/7 subway service resumed last week after its suspension during the pandemic. A Staten Island landlord lawyer who altered eviction notices to include the phrase Chinese Wuhan virus emergency had nearly 40 of her eviction cases dismissed in bulk. Governor Cuomo will earn over $5 million for his new book about New York's response to COVID-19, despite almost nobody buying the book. In elections news, new numbers released by the city's campaign finance board on the mayoral race show that Wall Street executive Ray McGuire, who has received huge contributions from rich donors and is not participating in the city's matching funds program, has spent over 70% of what he's raised leaving him with less cash on hand in the final month of the campaign than Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams, who has spent just over half of his total raised. Mayoral candidates and government ethics groups have called out Eric Adams' fundraising practices. They noted that Adams has held big money fundraisers with real estate developers whose projects were reviewed by his office, as well as groups who received grants his office dispersed. They also noted that Adams has failed to report donations throughout his career and has close ties to several lobbyists, two of whom are on the board of his nonprofit. Mai Wiley, whose mayoral campaign is low on cash heading into the final month, will now be getting financial support from a PAC funded by George Soros. Wiley previously worked at Soros's Open Society Foundation. Wiley was also endorsed by Representative Hakeem Jeffries in District 8, Bed-Stuy. Congressman Adriano Espaillat's District 13, Upper Manhattan, endorsed Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams for mayor. In his endorsement speech, Espaillat declared he is probably to the left of AOC and has read both volumes of Das Kapital. City and state evaluated the chances that the winner of next month's mayoral primary could come from behind with the new rake choice voting system. Diane Morales responded to reports of a bribe she paid a corrupt water inspector in 2004. The bribe may have foiled Mayor de Blasio's plans to appoint her to the city's Equal Employment Practices Commission in 2019. The NYC chapter of the National Association of Social Workers endorsed NYC-DSA candidates Alexa Velez, District 38 Sunset Park, and Jaslyn Kerr, District 23 Eastern Queens, for City Council. Street PAC endorsed NYC-DSA candidate Jaslyn Kerr, District 23 Eastern Queens, in its first round of endorsements for City Council. In Queens, Bob Holden, Democrat, Middle Village, one of the most conservative members of the City Council, who was first elected in 2017 as a Republican, faces a progressive primary challenger in the next month's Democratic primary, who will likely run again as a Republican if he loses. Now back to Amy Wilson.
Thank you so much, Jack Devine. Our headlines are brought to you by The Thorn, an incredible weekly newsletter by New York City DSA's Electoral Working Group, covering local politics and radical activism. You can subscribe at thethorn.nyc. And now I'd love to welcome our live guest for tonight's show, Kay Gabriel. Hi, Kay. Welcome to Revolutions Per Minute.
Hi, Amy. Thank you so much for having me.
So tell us a little bit about yourself and why you're here representing the Defund NYPD campaign of New York City DSA.
Absolutely. So I'm an organizer. I'm a writer. Right now I'm an adjunct university instructor. I live in Queens and I organize with the Queens branch. And I actually became an active as opposed to a paper member of DSA through the Defund campaign, and in part because sort of witnessing everything that happened this past year, I became convinced of with a number of other people, of a certain strategy and direction. So why defund? Why are we fighting to defund the NYPD and reinvest in our communities, right? And I put it that way, the full way, because I think that people have a lot of misunderstandings about defund, and I really want to clear those up, right? Defund is not just like, cut the cops' budget and like walk away, it's not just like mic drop, whatever, right? It is about understanding why police violence happens the way it does, what we can do to reverse it and to change this relationship, and how we can pursue public safety in a different way. So we understand that we cannot change police violence without changing the nature and scale of policing. In order to do that, we have to do something about the army of the NYPD, the largest non-military army in the world. That's at 36,000 uniformed officers, right? Which has seen its budget double to a total expenditure every year of $11 billion. Over the same period that in the past, 20 to 30 years, vital social services like housing, healthcare, parks have seen their budgets slashed or contract or go into some kind of managed decline through round after round of disinvestment and austerity, right? And so this kind of expansion of policing and a contraction of social services has happened at the same time. and in some ways for the same reasons, right? And so what Defund attempts to do is to pursue public safety in a different way by building up the institutions that give everybody what they need to thrive. And so that's what we're fighting for. Is that a helpful summary?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Very helpful. And we've had Defund NYPD here on Revolutions Per Minute in the past. Most recently, our great comrade Cheryl was here, and she myth busted some commonly held misconceptions about Defund NYPD. And we're going to maybe have an opportunity to do the same later in this show when we take live calls from our WBAI listening audience. But before we do that, I'm very pleased to introduce a special guest and interview for tonight. You're listening to Revolutions Per Minute, which is the officially endorsed radio show of New York City DSA. And regular listeners of our show have already heard from 5 out of the 6 DSA for the City slate of DSA-endorsed candidates since we started our series in January. And tonight, we're very pleased to say that we finally caught them all, if you will, and we've got our 6th of 6. Tiffany Cabán is a former public defender and a longtime de-carceral activist running for District 22 in Queens. We spoke to her about our pledge for real public safety, queer liberation, and much more. Now let's go to Desiree Joy Frias for that conversation.
Hi, New York City. I'm here with Tiffany Cabán, attorney, organizer, and candidate for City Council in Queens, District 22. Welcome, Tiffany.
Thanks for having me.
A pleasure. And just introduce yourself to our listeners and tell us about yourself and your district.
Yes, absolutely. So my name is Tiffany Cabán. I am running in District 22, which is my home. It includes Astoria, parts of East Elmhurst, parts of Woodside, parts of Jackson Heights. And actually, a lot of folks don't know this. It includes Rikers Island. And, I am running to make sure that we are building a city, quite frankly, that works for working people. People talk about city council and how hyper-local of a seat it is. And yes, that is true. We are running to make sure that we are filling the potholes and trimming the trees and taking care of, picking up the trash. But I always tell people that local does not mean small, and understanding that our city government, our municipal government is the largest, most powerful, richest in the country. And it's really just a prime space for transformational change when we talk about implementing systems that, again, just break down our systems of racialized capitalism and create an environment for, worker-led movements. I'm really excited about it. I think that this is the area where we slay giants and where socialists are able to come out and, be unapologetic about our politics, our values, from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to Zoran Mamdani, all the way down to our district leaders like Shauna Morlock and Zachariah Boyer. And we're just missing that at the city council level. So I am very, very excited to be here with y'all.
And let's talk about that wealth that New York City has. Our budget is one of the largest in the country. What budgeting priorities do you have for your first session in city council?
Yeah, just to put it into context, right? We're talking about a city government that has well over $88 billion and decides where the money goes and where it doesn't go. And we have all these conversations about defunding the police, and we don't talk about the things that we have been defunding every single year for decades. And so my priorities are making sure that we are using every single dollar to uplift and support our communities, to allow us to keep each other safe and healthy. An organizer out in Astoria Houses, his name is Andre. He put it so perfectly. He goes to me, Tiffany, everybody tells you it takes a village to raise a child, but who is uplifting and resourcing the village? And that's the job of government. That is where every single dollar of our budget should be going. Divesting from policing and incarceration and surveillance and state-sanctioned violence, and putting that money back into the community in the ways that we know keep us safe and healthy. So, affordable housing, healthcare, including comprehensive mental health care, our education systems, our public transportation, youth programs, elder care programs, violence interruption groups, all of these things. And it goes beyond just saying, hey, we want to defund the police, which yes, we do for a ton of really, really necessary reasons. But understanding that when we use our budget dollars to invest in a robust public health infrastructure and in a robust public safety infrastructure that's divorced from policing, we actually get more resources to work with because of the downstream savings from that when we take these public health first approaches. So I want to make sure that we are using the budget, and folks can actually check out I put like my hardcore policy wonk hat on for our public safety plan and worked with a ton of brilliant organizers in the space to put it together. But our public safety plan on the website, I mean, the big areas are, making sure that we have neighborhood level interventions that are tailored to the needs of all of our individual council districts. And so it includes proposals for community safety centers that, house family supports, violence prevention, mediation services, crisis intervention teams. It calls for the expansion of the CMS program. It calls for integrated service facilities with on-site safe consumption, services, treatment programs, peer support, legal and case management support, healthcare. I mean, the list goes on. Wraparound services for folks who are experiencing homelessness, restorative justice programming. It extends to our schools, non-police systems for responding to transportation and traffic related issues, and a civil life corps, right? Like civilian folks who can handle quality of life related matters and day-to-day issues that require resolution and for us to come to the table together. But that shouldn't warrant, bringing in uniformed armed officers into the space.
Absolutely. And all of these social problems, while they do require social change and for people to change the way that they look at society, the money makes a huge difference. And the way that we choose to fund or who we choose to fund is really what's going to make a big difference moving forward. And to talk a little bit more about the Defund NYPD City Council candidate pledge, because some people do equate safety or community safety with the number of police on the ground.
Yeah. I mean, I was really proud to not only have signed that pledge, but worked to put it together, right? Again, one of the things that I really love about our organization, DSA, is that it is a very participatory democratic process, and it's very intentional when we move on policy priorities and issues, and this was no different. And, in terms of defunding the police, I think it's just about being able to control a narrative that for very long has been controlled by moneyed corporate and police interests, right? But you can see it on the ground that these things don't keep us safe. And I want to give sort of two separate examples. But one, this is a moment to be captured, because for all of its horrors, for all of the hardship, the pandemic has created some opportunities. I've talked over and over again about how the literal definition of a crisis is a turning point. And so we have to capitalize on that and use it as an opportunity to radicalize, to mobilize, to organize. And this moment is no different. I'm a former public defender. Have done just a ton of work in, the abolition movement space, in the criminal legal reform space. And the biggest part of my fight has been redefining public safety, right? And here we are in the middle of a health pandemic where you could talk to anyone, and especially and including the folks that have had the privilege of not having bad interactions with the police or having the privilege of not being exposed to over-policing or over-criminalization. And in the past, where you'd ask them, like, what keeps you safe? They may say, well, it's police, it's prosecution, it's incarceration. But in the middle of a pandemic, when you ask folks, no matter who they are, what keeps you safe, the answers are different. They say access to healthcare, staying healthy, keeping food on their table, keeping a roof over their head. And yes, that is exactly what we're talking about. That's safety, right? That's safety and health. And then just understanding that we are leaning in to things that don't work, have not worked. And I can give, some examples recently that were given as to why we need more police. And it's actually the opposite. When we had those horrific stabbings in the subway, there was a call for more policing. But when you dive deeper, one, we know that the subways are already heavily policed. We know that the addition of more police officers there don't do anything to interrupt or prevent violent harm. but do a lot more to exacerbate, the racialized policing that we experience, where more people, more Black, brown, and low-income folks are arrested and harassed and sometimes hurt seriously for jumping a turnstile or having a little bit of weed or selling some food to try to support their families. And when you look at the horrible things that happened, that the folks that were killed were people experiencing homelessness. And this wouldn't have happened if we weren't in a city that left people so vulnerable without safe shelter and access to the things that they need, right? We know that the person who perpetrated these harms was also severely mentally ill. And it is a failure of government that we are not providing access to the kinds of services that actually would have prevented this kind of harm and taking those approaches. The same thing with the Times Square shooting, right? We're talking about one of the most heavily surveilled policed areas, not just in the city, but across the entire country. And I tell people all the time, the police, first of all, with that, over $6 billion budget, they don't do what the average person thinks that they do. They only spend 2 to 5% of their time responding to violent crime. And that's responding to. It's not interrupting. It's not preventing. And so when you look at that and you say, as big as the budget is, it's still finite. And we are pumping and pouring money into this strategy that is caused such harm, but also does not improve safety for decades, while we continue to starve all of these other essential areas, housing, healthcare, education, of the resources we actually need to stabilize lives, families, and communities.
Absolutely. And I think that really seeing Defund NYPD as a commitment to people in our community and to our neighbors, and not just as anti-police, but as pro our neighbors and pro their dignity and their lives, and recognizing that them living on the street is not an acceptable, alternative for us to have, or situation for us to have in this very rich community that we live in. But as a public defender, you had a lot of exposure to people who were in these kinds of difficult situations. How do you think that experience will translate into your role as an advocate in the city council?
I think it begins way before that, because what brought me to my work as a public defender certainly was my experience with our systems, right? But I think about even when we look back to my DA race, and I talked about the policy platform that I ran on then, it's very much so the same approach, right? Every single policy had a client's name and face attached to it, and a family and an experience, and a community. And we need to be making policy personal. We need to be making legislation personal and tying it back to our very human experiences. It's a powerful thing, I think, as a driver and a vehicle for change in this moment. But again, understanding that these things don't keep us safe, understanding that you can, when you criminalize poverty, mental health, substance use, and then you throw people in cages as a result, you're sending people back out in their communities worse than when they went in, creating much more unsafe conditions, right? So bringing that, and then just knowing that it is, it's not about good people and bad people and finding and locking up the bad folks. It is more about providing people with opportunities to heal, providing people with the tools in their toolbox to be able to resolve conflict together, and putting them in a position where they have all of the very human things that they need to survive in this world. Because we know when you can't meet your personal needs is when you are creating the breeding ground for harm. So knowing all of those things, not just from the thousands of cases that I took on as a public defender, but simply as a young, queer brown kid growing up in an over-policed, under-resourced community, and then having, the privilege and opportunity to enter some different spaces, not because I was exceptional in some way, but because there were a series of lucky factors. The fact that my dad got a union job and how that makes a difference in terms of what you have access to and what the trajectory is. I tell people all the time about, the fact that I am part of 2%, right? 2% of lawyers are Latinas. And it's not because we aren't smart, we aren't capable, we don't care about education or any of these things, but it is literally because there are a million different systemic, racist, classist barriers that don't allow us access to be able to push into these spaces.
And talking about representation, tell me about the beautifully diverse and incredible DSA for the city slate.
It is it is diverse on a ton of different fronts. One, when you look at us, you're like, okay, this is a multiracial working class movement, right? From me to Jasleen, to Brandon, to Michael, to Alexa, to Adolfo. And then you have just a diversity in our organizing stories coming from different spaces, whether it is, the criminal legal system work or the abolition work to, gender justice work to housing advocacy. And you're talking about folks who have interacted with our systems in a way that is just deeply, deeply personal. Identity politics are really important. People want to twist it all the time and say, oh, that's just identity politics, as though it's a negative. But when you go back to the root of the term, to its inception, to Barbara Smith and the Combahee River Collective, you know that identity politics are incredibly important. It's the idea that we must bring our whole selves to our politics, specifically because it is our identities, right, that interact with systems that were not created for us, that cause harm, that oppress, that marginalize, and it leaves us best situated to pinpoint where those problems are and ideate together what those solutions can and should be. And so those experiences are incredibly, incredibly vital to building the kind of world we want to live in. It's the difference between, by the way, saying, listen, and there are lots of people doing lots of great work around the city, but it is the difference between saying, I see inequity and I just want to do my part and help out in dismantling that and building something new, and saying, I live that inequity and this is tied to my survival. It's tied to the survival of my family, my neighbors, and my friends. And it brings a different level of not just urgency, but sort of like the elements that are required to lead in this space and build the kind of coalition that's needed for just mass movement and mass transformation.
And the people who push back against identity politics and intersectionality are typically and overwhelmingly white men. And they want us to put aside our womanhood, our race, our ethnicity, our queerness when it comes to us in power. And then they want to turn around and oppress us on those same bases at another time. So, yeah, I think that it's incredibly powerful to have the strength and the diversity that we have in the DSA for the city slate. And how will electing a socialist slate change our city for the better?
Again, I mean, you're talking about folks who are going to lead with understanding that the goal is to give power back to working people, right? Like understanding that we are about creating the conditions so that every single person can thrive. And just to like take a step back and say, well, what does this feel like on just a very like, I don't think surface level is the right way to articulate it, but here we are where all we have known, and it's the reason why so many folks, so many normal working class, working poor folks don't engage in electoral politics in the democratic process, not just because our systems are such that we are constantly destabilized and in crisis. And so engaging in those things becomes a privilege because we're just trying to survive, right? To make things work. But for decades and decades, we have had electeds and politicians who are serving other interests, whether they're taking money from corporate interests, whether they are taking money from law enforcement interests, but also understanding like where their power lies and where it comes from, and saying, hey, I want to be the elected official for the folks in the high rises and the people in public housing. And what you get with a socialist representative is saying, no. I am unapologetically going to be the champion and the elected official for you, the working class individual, you, the person who makes our city run, you, the worker who deserves a dignified existence, you and only you, because we know that we all benefit from that. And quite honestly, I also want to make sure that we're getting, on a very selfish level, getting more socialists in office too, because in my mind, it also advances the abolitionist movement, right? Socialism and abolition go hand in hand. And I'm just thinking how we keep growing our movement to create this beautiful, community and environment where we are getting rid of, our prison industrial complex. We're getting rid of state-sanctioned violence. And when we talk about what are the conditions that need to exist, they are fundamentally like an overlap of, abolitionist and socialist values, right? And this is about dismantling, again, our system of racialized capitalism and creating a space for racial and economic justice.
So it's almost June, and as two women of color who are queer, I wanted to give you some space to talk about queer liberation and what that looks like for you for the next 5 years.
I mean, when I think about what our ancestors, and I'm talking about our beautiful queer ancestors, they have done a lot to shape my politics and my values. And I know that I am able to stand in my power as a queer brown woman because they stood in theirs. And June is always a big month of reflection for me and pride and also some mourning. But I just think about the fact that when we talk about our queer and trans and gender nonconforming queer family, these are the folks that have been on the margins of the margins, who have put their bodies and everything else on the line for the rest of us. And it's other folks that experience and are able to enjoy the gains of those sacrifices first and most. And I think about that a lot. And it is one of the things that also just makes me push and continue to be very unapologetic about entering spaces and letting people know exactly who I am and where I come from and how our history informs our present and is going to continue to inform our future struggles. Sorry, that's my dog, Natalie. She gets very jealous.
You just heard Tiffany Cabán and her dog Natalie with Desiree Joy Frias. Tiffany is running for City Council in District 22 of Queens. She's a member of our DSA for the City slate. And please go back and check out all 6 candidate interviews that we've done here on Revolutions Per Minute. You are listening to Revolutions Per Minute on listener-sponsored WBAI in New York City, broadcasting at 99.5 FM, streaming on your favorite podcast app. Today, we're talking about DSA's plan to defund the police and refund the people. I'm Amy Wilson, here live with a wonderful organizer, Kay Gabriel, who is ready to take your questions about defunding the police and what that means. I should say, Kay, before you jump in and correct me, defunding the police and refunding the people, say the whole thing. The number to call if you have any questions particularly, or things that you've always wanted to know more about this campaign to defund NYPD, please give us a call. The number is 212-209-2877. Once again, that number is 212-209-2877. 7. So, Kay, talk to me a little bit about the current strategy of the Defund NYPD campaign. What do you have going on? What are you trying with your approach right now?
Absolutely. So, I guess we basically have a kind of two prongs to our strategy. One is, and you'll have just heard about this from Tiffany, who I think is like just a wonderful advocate who can like really just parse apart the vision for defund and also some of the worries that people have about it and explain why those are not actually founded. Right. And so one prong of our strategy is to elect a slate of socialist and abolitionist candidates to city council who can form a bloc to push defund at the legislative level, who can make it a priority, who can make it work on the inside with other people who are somehow aligned with us. Right. And so, primary is June 22nd, and we're really going all in for our candidates. The other side is building a pressure campaign on the outside through community organizing, through coalition building, through strategic direct action, and through creative use of art and media to really build a vision for defund as a radical demand, right? And so what does that look like concretely? Well, next week from Monday, May 31st to Sunday, June the 6th, we're having a week of action. And I would love listeners at WI, whether or not you're DSA members, but especially DSA members, but like everybody, please come to our week of action. We have a social and direct action training and art build that's on Monday. And we have a mass march on the Saturday, June 5th. And we have other stuff. We have like a walking tour of New York's carceral geography. We have street theater. We have a discussion series, I believe, with DSA's labor branch about how policing and incarceration intensify class struggle at every point in our lives. The link to find this calendar of events and to sign up is defundnypd.com/WOA. Which I think will be in the show notes when this gets posted online. So please do come to our week of action. We are hoping that this will catalyze another month of vibrant organizing and protest to escalate and intensify pressure on city council and let them know that for all their suppression and for all of, like last year, they goosed us around with fake budget math to make it seem as if they shuffled money around. They did not actually take money from NYPD and put it into social services, right? That is a lie that people like Dermot Shea and whoever else like to say a lot. But to let them know, we're not fooled, right? We haven't gone away. And not only that, but we are building and we are stronger this year. And next year, we are going to be even stronger still. So week of action, please come.
Right on. Yeah. And, this is an important anniversary this week, the anniversary of both the murder of George Floyd and of the uprising that started in Minneapolis and quickly spread to cities across the country, including right here in New York City. And I do just want to remind our listeners that the phones are open if you'd like to give us a call to ask a question or make a respectful comment about what we're speaking about tonight on the show. The number to call is 212-209-2877, 212-209-2877 to speak with Revolutions Per Minute. And we do apologize for the technical difficulties that we had at the beginning of the show. You may or may not know that NYC-DSA is an organization full of astrology nerds. So I'd love to just say by way of explanation that Mercury is retrograde right now, so I'm going to chalk it up to that. And while we wait for anybody to give us a call, if we do have any folks listening in the audience tonight who'd like to speak with us, Kay, I'd love to hear a little bit more about the resistance that we find to defund, both from the sources that you might expect, the cops themselves, but also from some unexpected sources. So can you speak a little bit to how the defund campaign might respond to those criticisms?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, let's be real. Defund is the only, it is an indispensable part of our solution to end police violence, right? The reforms that liberal reformers believe will work, things like give the police more training, hire more diverse police forces, have scare quote community policing, give police body cameras. They have all been tried and they do not change the nature and scale of policing. Police in the United States kill 1,000 people a year, every year. That number has remained rock solid since the riots and protests of 2014 and 2015 in response to the police murders of Mike Brown and Eric Garner and Freddie Gray and Philando Castile and the death in police custody of Sandra Bland. These are, and the reason why this number remains constant despite all of these things is because police are, the function of police, what police do, is to violently constrain and control populations who have been deprived of access to things that they need to survive. This is what Tiffany was talking about, right? So, like all of these, all of these reforms that are all these solutions that are no solutions at all will never actually solve this problem. The only thing that will solve this problem is changing the structure of our society to move money from death-dealing institutions into institutions that support everybody's ability to live. Okay. So we have this effective demand. It's a radical demand. It actually addresses and identifies the nature of the problem. So of course the right wing and the center right, which is to say mainstream Democrats, have propagandized against defund with everything they've got. And as a result, people are scared. People have all kinds of thoughts and feelings about police and public safety. Also, like as Alex Vitale points out in his book, The End of Policing, for 40 years, severely poor communities could only get resources from cities in the form of police. Right. And so when you poll people, do you want, fewer police officers? Do you want to defund? They respond by saying, no, I don't want that. Right. And so the poll numbers make defund look like not especially popular. But what people are actually saying, they're not saying I want more police officers. They're saying I want to be safe. Right. And what we understand when we look at the data, we understand that police do not actually keep people safe. Right. They have been associated with safety. The massive saturation of police officers is something through things like broken windows policing, which NYPD commissioner in the 90s, Bill Bratton, piloted, and then which was kind of exported elsewhere around the country and around the globe, right? Was supposed to propagandize, again, to make this connection between policing and safety, but it is not true, right? So then we have the situation where defund polls badly. Okay, well, this is an organizing problem. So if people on the left, even comradely people on the left who are making who are making critiques in good faith, right? Even these people will say, oh, well, like the demand, this is what, like they'll say like, oh, this demand from the biggest protest movement in decades, this demand should be more popular. Well, okay, this is an organizing problem. This is not a problem of sloganeering. It's not a problem of finding the right words that will magically summon class consciousness. It is an organizing problem. And it is less than a year old. And as Jason Perez from Chicago DSA recently pointed out, for being a kind of radical demand that burst onto a national scene, again, less than a year ago, basically within short-term memory, it's had phenomenal success, limited success, but for the amount of time that we've been working with it, phenomenal success, right? So this is an organizing problem. And that's what we are confronting in the Defund NYPD campaign and in the defund, in all the different defunds campaigns nationally and internationally, and in the abolitionist movement in general. This is a movement that has been going for decades to make people understand, to get people to understand that prisons and police are a form of class war, and we do not have to live this way. We can live in a different way.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for those very impassioned and clear remarks, Kay. I really appreciate a lot of what you have to say, especially pulling on the legacy of police and prison abolitionism that, as you say, is very much not a new thing. There are, ancestors of that movement who have been working on this for years and years. I also appreciate you hit on one of my biggest pet peeves when you talked about sloganeering and this idea that if you just find the right combination of words, that will be the key to unlocking the door of class consciousness. To me, that's the West Wing, right? That's a fantasy. That's not material. It's not how we're trying to engage in politics on the socialist left. So it just drives me crazy. So thank you so much for debunking that myth with us here tonight on Revolutions Per Minute, Kay Gabriel. And we are coming to the end of the show for tonight. So we want to thank our listeners and absolutely want to thank you, Kay, and just ask if you have any final words before we sign off.
Yeah, I do. I want to pick up. Thank you so much, Amy, also for having me. I want to pick up on something that actually Tiffany said in her interview. Because I think there's a lot of propaganda right now that's, focused on things like, let's say, stochastic violence, sort of random stabbings. You don't know the person. It just happens. It's horrible, in the subways, in Times Square, and all the whole machine of propaganda. So that's, the police themselves, also their unions, PBA, SBA, also things like the New York Police Foundation, which is a nonprofit that supports the police, as if an army that with 36,000 uniformed officers and an $11 billion yearly expenditure requires a nonprofit foundation, charitable foundation to support it. But apparently they think they do, right? So all of these people are like, okay, well, no, clearly this is, all of these random acts of violence should make you feel deeply unsafe, and therefore actually we need to strengthen policing instead of restructuring our world so it no longer is necessary, right? And I think that Tiffany hit on this really strongly, and I just want to say it again. For transit workers and transit riders to be safe, the thing that will make transit workers and transit riders safe is universal housing and universal healthcare. It is not more police in the subways, right? Every single instance of violence, I'm going to say this, every single one, and I dare someone to prove me wrong, every single instance of violence in the subways could have been addressed if the person who did the harm in question had stable access to housing and stable access to the healthcare they needed. Every single one. So no one can come in and say, oh, this is the problem police can solve. Police are not built to solve that problem. So that is madness to me personally. And we need to stand up and say it really strongly, really loudly, so everyone can hear.
Great.
That's what I have to say about that.
Lovely. Wonderful. And, I think I do also dare somebody to prove you wrong. And I think it's worth a try, right? Even if it doesn't solve every problem, and even if there are bumps along the road as we work to defund NYPD and refund NYC, it's worth a try. So thank you so much, Kay, for being with us here tonight. You've been listening to Revolutions Per Minute on listener-sponsored WBAI in New York City, broadcasting at 99.5 FM. To connect with us after the show, please email us at revolutionsnyc@gmail.com. You can find us on our website, revolutionsperminute.simplecast.com, or on Twitter at NYCRPM. I'm Amy Wilson, and we'll see you next week, where we'll be talking about Palestine solidarity and the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. Thanks to everybody listening. Thanks to Max in the studio. And you can always look for Revolutions Per Minute wherever people are gathered to organize for our collective liberation. Good night.